A pregnant slave girl desperate for freedom. A hidden sanctuary in a stranger's barn. And a discovery that would change two lives forever. Sometimes mercy appears in the most unexpected places, and love grows in the shadows where the world refuses to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the tobacco fields like guilt, refusing to lift. August in Virginia, 1858, carried the weight of summer heat and something heavier, the suffocating certainty that some lives were deemed worth less than others. In the pre-dawn darkness, before the overseer's bell would shatter the quiet, a young woman named Mercy Washington pressed her palm against the growing curve of her belly and made a decision that would either save her or destroy her. Her bare feet had memorized every loose board in the slave quarters, every creak that might betray movement in the night. She was 19, though the plantation records listed her as property, not person, valued at $800, same as a good horse. Her hands, calloused from years in the cotton and tobacco fields of the Hartwell plantation, trembled as she gathered the few belongings that mattered: a worn quilt her grandmother had stitched, a wooden comb carved by her father before he was sold away, and a small cloth bundle containing the herbs her mother had taught her to use for healing. Baby inside her kicked, as if sensing the urgency. 6 months along, and showing enough that Master Hartwell's wife had begun to eye her with the cold calculation of someone planning a sale. Pregnant slaves brought good money, 2 lives for the price of 1.5. Mercy had overheard the conversation through the kitchen window where she'd been scrubbing pots. Mrs. Hartwell's voice, sharp as broken glass. "That girl will birth us a fine profit, Thomas. The millers down in Charleston are paying top dollar for breeding stock. Breeding stock." The words had hit Mercy like a physical blow, stealing her breath and nearly sending her to her knees among the dirty dishwater. Her child not even born, yet already reduced to future property, a commodity to be bought and sold like corn or cattle. The father of her baby was gone now, sold 3 months ago to a plantation in Georgia after Master Hartwell discovered their secret meetings by the creek. Samuel had been a house slave, educated enough to read and write, brave enough to love despite the consequences. The night before they took him away, he'd whispered promises against her ear. "Find the way north, Mercy. Find the underground road. Our baby deserves to breathe free air." But the underground road was a whisper, a rumor, a hope that might as well have been the moon, for all its accessibility to a pregnant girl with no money, no connections, and no knowledge of the world beyond the plantation's borders. The closest she'd come to freedom was the old stories her grandmother told, tales of slaves who vanished into the night and were never seen again. Some said they made it north. Others whispered they'd been caught and made examples of, their screams carrying across the fields for days. Still, as Mercy crept through the darkness that August morning, she carried those stories like talismans. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Freedom ain't a place, child. It's a choice. And sometimes you gotta choose it over and over, even when the world tells you that choice ain't yours to make." The plantation stretched out before her, 300 acres of tobacco and cotton, bordered by dense woods that seemed a whisper of both sanctuary and danger. She knew the immediate grounds by heart. The big house with its white columns and pretensions of grandeur. The overseer's cottage where Jonas Briggs slept with his whip beside his bed. The quarters where 43 souls endured lives of forced labor and fractured families. But beyond that familiar geography lay the unknown. Mercy had heard whispers of a network of safe houses, of abolitionists who risked everything to help people like her find freedom. The problem was finding them before the slave catchers found her. Pregnant women didn't run far or fast, and the reward notices would spread through Virginia like wildfire once her absence was discovered. She moved through the vegetable garden, Past the smokehouse where ham and bacon hung like small prayers for sustenance. Past the chicken coop where the birds stirred restlessly in their sleep. Every shadow seemed to hide an overseer. Every sound threatened to expose her flight. The baby shifted inside her, and she placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering a promise. "We're going to make it, little one. Somehow we're going to find a place where you can grow up free." The woods loomed ahead, dark and infinite. Mercy had explored their edges during brief moments of freedom. Sunday afternoons when the slaves were allowed a few hours to themselves, or evenings when she'd slip away to gather medicinal plants her mother had taught her to identify. But venturing deep into their depths, alone and pregnant, with no real destination beyond north, felt like stepping off the edge of the world. She paused at the tree line, looking back at the only home she'd ever known. Home, what a strange word for a place of bondage. Yet these quarters had sheltered her through childhood illnesses, had witnessed her first steps, her mother's lullabies, her father's stories before he was torn away from them. The other slaves sleeping in those rough cabins were her family by circumstance and choice, bound together by shared suffering and small joys stolen from an oppressive system. Leaving them felt like betrayal, but staying felt like surrender. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Mercy took it as encouragement. Samuel's child would not be born into chains. That decision, at least, was hers to make. She stepped into the woods, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Behind her, the plantation continued its restless sleep, unaware that one of its investments had just declared her own independence. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope that somewhere in the vast world beyond these trees, freedom might be more than just a word whispered in the dark. The forest floor was soft beneath her feet, cushioned by years of fallen leaves, and the rich loam of Virginia soil. Mercy moved as quietly as she could, guided by the faint light of stars filtering through the canopy above. She had no compass, no map, only the knowledge that north meant freedom and the desperate hope that she could find safe harbor before her pregnancy made travel impossible. Every few hundred yards, she paused to listen. The woods were alive with night sounds, owls calling, small creatures rustling through underbrush, the distant howl of what might have been wolves or hunting dogs. Her heart hammered against her ribs at every unexpected noise, imagination transforming innocent forest sounds into the baying of bloodhounds and the shouts of pursuing men. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes' time had lost meaning in the disorienting darkness. Mercy's legs began to ache, and the baby's weight seemed to grow heavier with each step. She'd brought water in a small gourd, but no food beyond a handful of dried corn. The adrenaline that had carried her through the initial escape was beginning to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of her situation. A pregnant teenage girl, alone in the wilderness with no clear destination and limited supplies. But giving up wasn't an option. Behind her lay certain bondage for herself and her child. Ahead, at least, lay possibility. So she kept walking, one painful step at a time, through the Virginia wilderness toward an uncertain dawn and the fragile hope of freedom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Virginia wilderness stretched endlessly before Mercy, a labyrinth of ancient oaks and towering pines that seemed to close ranks behind her with each step. Forward, dawn came slowly, painting the forest floor in patches of pale gold that shifted with the wind-stirred branches above. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and the baby had grown restless inside her, responding to her body's stress with sharp kicks that sometimes stole her breath. She had been walking for what felt like hours when the sound reached her distant, but unmistakable. Dogs, not the lazy hounds that lounged around the plantation quarters, but working dogs with purpose in their voices. Hunting dogs. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. They'd discovered her absence sooner than she'd hoped. Perhaps one of the other slaves had been forced to report her missing during the morning roll call. Or maybe Overseer Briggs had noticed her empty sleeping space during his routine checks. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the baying growing. Closer, carried on the morning breeze like a death sentence. Mercy pressed deeper into the woods, fighting panic. Pregnant women left strong scent trails, and these Virginia hunting dogs were legendary for their ability to track runaway slaves across impossible distances. She needed water, a stream or creek to break her trail, but the dense forest revealed no hint of running water, only endless trees and the growing certainty that she was being hunted. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the jolting pace she'd been forced to maintain. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered, placing a protective hand over her belly. "Just hold on a little longer. We're going to find somewhere safe, I promise." But promises felt hollow when measured against the reality of bloodhounds and slave catchers, against the Virginia laws that made helping a runaway slave a criminal offense, against a society that viewed her unborn child as future property rather than a human being deserving of freedom. The forest began to thin as she climbed a gentle slope, and through the trees ahead, Mercy caught glimpses of cultivated landfields and fences that meant civilization. Her heart sank. Civilization meant people, and people in Virginia in 1858 were more likely to return a runaway slave for the reward money than to offer help. But the dogs were getting closer, and she had no choice but to risk human contact. She crested the hill and found herself looking down at a small farm nestled in a valley. Unlike the sprawling Hartwell plantation with its grand house and numerous outbuildings, this was a modest operation, a simple two-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding, a red barn that had seen better days, and fields of corn and wheat that spoke of subsistence farming rather than cash crops worked by slave labor. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney, which meant the inhabitants were awake and beginning their day. Mercy crouched behind a fallen log, studying the scene below. A man emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of milk, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Even from a distance, she could see he was young, probably no more than 30, with sandy brown hair and the lean build of someone who worked his own land rather than commanding others to work it for him. The sound of the dogs grew more distinct, and Mercy realized she was out of time for careful observation. She had to make a choice: approach this unknown farmer and risk capture, or continue running through unfamiliar territory with bloodhounds on her trail. Neither option offered much hope, but at least the farm provided the possibility of hiding places. She waited until the man disappeared back into the house, then made her way down the slope as quickly as her condition allowed. The farmyard was well maintained, but showed signs of a single person's labor repairs that were functional rather than pretty. Gardens that were productive, but not ornamental. As she drew closer to the barn, Mercy noticed something that made her heart race with desperate hope. The building was substantial, with a hayloft that might offer concealment. The barn door stood slightly ajar, and she slipped inside, immediately enveloped by the sweet smell of hay and the warm, comforting presence of livestock. 3 cows occupied stalls along one wall, while chickens scratched and pecked in a fenced area near the door. But it was the towering mounds of hay stored in the loft above that captured her. Attention, golden mountains of dried grass that could hide a person, even a pregnant person, if arranged carefully. A ladder led to the loft, and Mercy climbed it with effort, her swollen belly making the ascent awkward and precarious. The loft was spacious, filled with loose hay and several large, tightly packed bales. She worked quickly but quietly, hollowing out a space in one of the larger piles near the back wall, creating a cave-like depression where she could lie hidden. As she settled into her makeshift hiding place, arranging loose hay to cover the entrance, the sound of the dogs grew loud enough that she could distinguish individual voices in the pack. They'd reached the farm. Her hands shook as she pulled hay over herself, trying to create natural-looking coverage while leaving enough space to breathe. Through gaps in the hay, she could see patches of the barn below and slivers of sunlight streaming through cracks in the walls. The familiar sounds of morning farm life continued: chickens clucking, cows lowing softly, the distant sound of the farmhouse door opening and closing. Then new voices joined the mix, harsh and demanding. "Morning," called an unfamiliar voice. From the farmyard, "We're tracking a runaway slave. Young Negra woman, pregnant. Dogs picked up her trail leading this direction. You seen anything unusual?" Mercy held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard throughout the barn. The baby, perhaps sensing her terror, had gone completely still inside her. "Can't say I have," came the reply. The voice was calm, unhurried, the same tone the farmer might use to discuss the weather or crop prices. "Been out doing morning chores, saw nothing but the usual wildlife. Mind if we search your property? That girl's worth good money, and we aim to collect." A pause that seemed to stretch forever. "I suppose that's your right, given the circumstances. Though I'll ask you to be respectful of my livestock. Stressed animals don't produce well." Mercy closed her eyes and tried to make herself as small as possible. Through the barn walls, she could hear the slave catchers spreading out across the property, their dogs sniffing and investigating every corner of the farmyard. One set of footsteps approached the barn, and she bit her lip to keep from whimpering. With fear, the barn door creaked as it was pushed fully open, allowing more light to flood the interior. Heavy boots crossed the wooden floor below, and a dog's enthusiastic sniffing echoed through the space. Mercy pressed her face into the hay, breathing as shallowly as possible, praying that her scent had been masked by the stronger smells of animals and dried grass. "Nothing down here but livestock," called the searcher. "I'll check the loft." Mercy's world contracted to the sound of boots on wooden rungs as someone climbed toward her hiding place. She could hear the man breathing heavily from the exertion, could smell tobacco and unwashed clothing as he drew closer. The hay around her seemed inadequate, gossamer thin protection against discovery and certain capture. The searcher's head and shoulders appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the brighter light below. He spent long moments scanning the loft, and Mercy was certain he must see some telltale sign of her presence: a displaced bale, an unnatural depression in the hay, something that would give her away. "See anything up there, Morrison?" called another voice from below. "Just hay," came the reply, but the man didn't immediately descend. Instead, he climbed fully into the loft and began poking at the larger piles with a long stick, probing for anything that shouldn't be there. The stick passed within inches of Mercy's hiding place, close enough that she could feel the displacement of air as it moved. She held herself absolutely still, even when loose hay fell into her eyes and nose, threatening to make her sneeze. The baby had begun moving again, gentle shifts that felt enormous in the confined space, and she pressed both hands against her belly, silently begging her unborn child to be still. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the searcher climbed back down the ladder. "Nothing," he announced. "Waste of time if you ask me. Trail probably led this way but kept going. Could be miles away by now." Through the gaps in her hiding place, Mercy watched the man's legs disappear as he descended. The voices in the farmyard continued for several more minutes, discussions of search patterns and reward money, speculation about where a pregnant runaway might be heading. Then, gradually, the sounds faded as the search party moved on to investigate neighboring properties. Silence settled over the farm like a blessing, broken only by the normal sounds of livestock and the gentle whisper of wind through the hay. Mercy remained motionless for a long time, afraid that the searchers might return, afraid that any movement might somehow alert them to her presence, even at a distance. When she finally allowed herself to relax slightly, the full magnitude of her situation began to sink in. She had escaped immediate capture, but she was still trapped. The dogs had followed her trail directly to this farm, which meant the slave catchers would remember this place, might return if they failed to find her elsewhere. And she was pregnant. Alone, with no food or water, hiding in a stranger's barn with no idea whether the farmer who owned it was friend or enemy. The farmer she'd heard the searcher call him Morrison had allowed the search but hadn't seemed eager to help. That could mean anything. Maybe he was simply being cautious, not wanting to get involved in other people's business. Maybe he genuinely hadn't seen her and was being truthful with the slave catchers. Or maybe he'd seen her enter his barn and was planning to claim the reward money for himself once the search party had moved on. As the day wore on, Mercy listened to the rhythm of farm life continuing below and around her hiding place. She heard Morrison moving through the barn periodically, tending to his animals, the steady sound of milk hitting a metal bucket during evening milking. Each time he entered, she held her breath, wondering if this would be the moment he discovered her presence and decided her fate. The baby had grown increasingly active as the day progressed, responding to her stress and hunger with movements that sometimes made her gasp, despite her efforts to remain silent. She'd brought no food and her water was nearly gone. If she remained hidden much longer, hunger and thirst would force her to reveal herself anyway. As darkness began to fall, painting the loft in deeper shadows, Mercy faced a terrible choice. She could continue hiding, hoping the farmer would remain unaware of her presence while she slowly weakened from hunger and thirst. Or she could reveal herself, trusting her life and her child's future to a stranger whose intentions remained completely unknown. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if making the decision for her. Whatever happened next, it had to be better than slowly starving in a pile of hay. She began to shift the covering away from her hiding place, preparing to emerge and face whatever consequences awaited a pregnant runaway slave who had dared to dream of freedom. The barn held its breath as Mercy emerged from her hiding place, like a ghost materializing from golden shadows. Hay clung to her dark hair and the rough fabric of her dress, and her movements were stiff from hours of forced stillness. The loft seemed impossibly quiet after the day's tension, broken only by the soft lowing of cattle below and the distant sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus. She had made her decision. Starvation was a slow death, and her baby deserved better than to die unnamed in a pile of hay. If Morrison meant to turn her in for the reward money, at least she would face that fate on her feet rather than waste away in hiding. Mercy climbed down the ladder with careful deliberation, her swollen belly making each rung a challenge. The Gemtu barn's main floor felt enormous after the cramped confines of her hiding place, and the familiar smells of livestock and grain seemed almost overwhelming to her heightened senses. Through gaps in the barn walls, she could see that true darkness had fallen, stars beginning to appear in the clear Virginia sky. She approached the barn door slowly, listening for any sign of human activity. The farmhouse windows glowed with warm lamplight, and she could make out the silhouette of a figure moving inside Morrison, presumably going about his evening routine. Smoke still rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of wood fire and something that might have been cooking food. Her stomach cramped with hunger at the thought. For several minutes, she stood frozen in the doorway, paralyzed by indecision. Every instinct screamed at her to remain hidden, to find another way, to avoid putting her trust in a white man whose loyalties were completely unknown. But the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, reminding her that she was responsible for more than just her own survival. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Mercy stepped out of the barn and began walking toward the farmhouse. Each step felt like crossing a vast distance, though the actual space was no more than 50 yards. The farmyard was well maintained, but showed the signs of a single person's labor, neat, but not fancy functional. Rather than ornamental. As she drew closer to the house, she could see through the kitchen window. Morrison sat at a simple wooden table, eating what appeared to be a modest supper by the light of a single oil lamp. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with light brown hair that needed cutting and the lean, weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. His clothes were clean but patched in places. Speaking of careful economy rather than poverty, there was something in his manner that made her hesitate. He ate slowly, methodically, but his posture suggested alertness rather than relaxation. Occasionally, he would pause and cock his head slightly, as if listening for something. It occurred to Mercy that he might already know she was there, might have known all along. She raised her hand to knock on the kitchen door, then froze as Morrison suddenly pushed back from the table and stood. Had he heard something? Seen her? Shadow passed by the window. Her first instinct was to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, and she realized that running was no longer an option. If he'd spotted her, fleeing would only confirm his suspicions and likely bring the slave catchers back at a run. The door opened before she could knock. Morrison stood in the doorway, lamplight spilling around him onto the porch steps where she waited. He was taller than she'd expected, with gray eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single glance. Her pregnancy, her exhaustion, the hay still clinging to her clothes, the desperate fear she couldn't quite hide. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mercy found herself studying his face, searching for any sign of hostility or greed, any indication that he was already calculating the reward money her capture would bring. Instead, she saw something unexpected, sadness, as if her presence confirmed something he'd hoped wouldn't be true. "You've been in my barn all day," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Mercy lifted her chin, trying to summon dignity she didn't feel. "Yes, sir. The slave catchers were here this morning." "Yes, sir, I heard them." Morrison stepped back slightly, though he didn't invite her inside. "You're the pregnant girl they were hunting." "I am." There seemed no point in denial. He was quiet for another moment, his eyes moving from her face to her swollen belly and back again. "How far along are you?" The question surprised her. 6 months, near as I can tell. "And the father?" Mercy's jaw tightened. "Sold away to Georgia 3 months back." Something shifted in Morrison's expression at that, though she couldn't quite read what it meant. He glanced past her toward the barn, then back at the road that led to his property. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "If they don't find you elsewhere, they'll expand their search. Come back through here with fresh dogs." "I know." Mercy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't stay. I just ... I need water. Something to eat. Then I'll be on my way." "On your way where?" She had no answer for that. North was a direction, not a destination, and she had no knowledge of safe houses or underground railroad contacts. She'd been operating on hope and desperation rather than any concrete plan. Morrison seemed to understand her silence. "Come inside," he said, stepping back to make room. "You can't travel in your condition, especially not at night." Mercy hesitated. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "The law says." "I know what the law says." His voice carried a weight of emotion she couldn't identify. "The law says a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're right." She followed him into the kitchen, immediately overwhelmed by the warmth and the smell of real food. The space was simple but clean, with a large fireplace, a well-scrubbed wooden table, and shelves lined with preserved goods and simple dishware. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but took care of what he had. Morrison gestured toward a chair at the table. "Sit. You look ready to fall over." Mercy lowered herself into the chair with relief, her swollen ankles grateful for the chance to rest. Morrison moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, ladling something from a pot on the stove into a bowl, cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread, pouring milk from a pitcher into a glass dot when he set the meal in front of her. Mercy had to blink back tears. Bean soup, still warm, with chunks of ham and vegetables. Fresh bread with real butter. Cold milk that tasted like luxury after months of whatever scraps she could manage. She wanted to fall on the food like a starving animal, but forced herself to eat slowly, mindful of her dignity and the fact that rich food might make her sick. After so many meals of cornmeal and whatever vegetable she could forage, Morrison sat across from her but didn't eat, instead watching her with those gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mercy Washington," she replied between spoonfuls of soup. "I'm James Morrison. This is my farm been in my family for 2 generations. Mercy nodded, unsure how to respond. The soup was making her feel human again. But she couldn't shake the awareness that she was completely at this man's mercy. One word from him, and the slave catchers would return with their dogs in chains. "Mercy's a good name," Morrison continued. "Your parents choose it?" "My grandmother said the world needed more mercy than it was willing to give." Mercy took another spoonful of soup, then added quietly, "She died when I was 12, worked to death in the fields." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. She wasn't accustomed to white people expressing sympathy for the death of a slave, wasn't prepared for the genuine sadness she heard in his words. "The baby's father," Morrison said carefully. "You loved him?" Mercy's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "Samuel, he could read and write. Taught me some when we could steal moments together. He used to say our baby would grow up free, that he'd find a way to make it happen." Her voice cracked slightly. "Master Hartwell found out about us, sold Samuel the next day." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "And now you're trying to make his dream come true." "I can't let my baby be born into chains. I won't." The words came out fiercer than she'd intended, and she immediately worried she'd revealed too much defiance, too much of the dangerous independence that had led to her current situation. But Morrison only nodded. No child should be born into bondage. The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Mercy's heart race. Was he expressing a general philosophical position, or was he telling her something more specific about his willingness to help? "Mr. Morrison," she began carefully, "I appreciate the food and the kindness, but I know the law. Helping a runaway slave is a serious crime. I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask," he interrupted gently. "I offered." "But why?" "You don't know. Me, I could be trouble for you." Morrison was quiet for so long that Mercy wondered if he'd decided not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, distant. "My sister was pregnant once, unmarried. The father abandoned her when he found out, and our parents. They weren't understanding people. She tried to run away, find somewhere she could raise her child without shame." Mercy felt her breath catch. "What happened to her?" "She died trying to cross a river in winter. Her and the baby both." Morrison's hands were clenched on the table, knuckles white. "I was away at university, didn't even know she was in trouble until it was too late." The pain in his voice was so raw that Mercy felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry. I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to help a woman in similar circumstances, I would. Didn't matter what the law said or what it might cost me." He met her eyes directly. "Your circumstances are different, but the principle is the same. You're trying to protect your child. That's something I understand." Mercy sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was telling her. This man, this white farmer she'd never met before today, was willing to risk everything to help her because of a tragedy in his own past. It seemed too good to be true. Too much like the kind of miracle she'd stopped believing in years ago. "What are you saying exactly?" she asked, afraid to hope. Morrison pushed back from the table and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "I'm saying you can stay here until the baby comes. There's a room above the kitchen that's not being used. You can help with farm work as you're able, earn your keep. After the child is born and you've recovered, I'll help you get north to people who can assist you further." Mercy's spoon clattered to the table. "You would do that? Risk your farm, your freedom, maybe your life?" Morrison turned back to her, and in the lamplight, she could see the determination in his face. "I've lived with regret for 7 years, Mercy. I won't live with it for the rest of my life." The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if approving of the plan. Mercy placed both hands on her belly, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden shift. From desperation to hope, the slave catchers will come back. Then we'll be ready for them. If they find me here, they won't. Morrison's voice carried quiet confidence. "I know this land better than they do. And I know how to make a pregnant woman disappear when necessary." Mercy stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. After months of fear, after a day of terror, was she really being offered sanctuary by a stranger who asked nothing in return but the chance to right an old wrong? "Why should I trust you?" she whispered. Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd met him, a sad but genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "Because, Mercy Washington, sometimes the world does give us more mercy than we're willing to believe possible." The room above the kitchen was small but clean, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline and a single window that looked out over Morrison's wheat fields. It contained a narrow bed with a quilt that had seen better days, a washstand with a chipped pitcher and basin, and a wooden chair that wobbled slightly on uneven legs. To Mercy, who had spent her entire life sleeping on straw pallets in cramped slave quarters, it felt like luxury. Morrison had shown her to the room after their conversation in the kitchen, carrying an oil lamp to light the way up the narrow staircase. "It's not much," he'd said, setting the lamp on the washstand. "But it's private. The stairs creak something fierce, so you'll hear anyone coming up long before they reach the door." He'd paused in the doorway, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "There's a chamber pot under the bed, and I'll bring you wash water in the mornings. If you hear riders in the yard, there's a loose board behind the bed that leads to a space under the eaves. It's cramped, but you could hide there if necessary." The practicality of his preparations had both comforted and unsettled Mercy. It was clear that Morrison had thought through the logistics of hiding a runaway slave, which suggested either extensive planning or previous experience. She wasn't sure which possibility worried her more. Now, 3 days later, she was beginning to understand that James Morrison was a man who planned for contingencies because life had taught him that disaster could arrive without warning. He approached everything with the same methodical care, from the way he organized his tools in the barn to the precise timing of his daily chores. Each morning, he brought her warm water for washing and a simple breakfast of eggs, bread, and milk. He would inquire politely about her health and the baby's movements, then outline any tasks he thought she might be able to help with: mending torn harnesses, shelling beans, preserving vegetables from his garden. The work was light but purposeful, designed to make her feel useful rather than like a burden. What surprised Mercy most was Morrison's genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. During their shared meals, he would ask about her knowledge of medicinal plants, her observations about his livestock, her suggestions for improving the efficiency of certain farm tasks. It had been so long since anyone had treated her words as valuable that she initially responded with suspicion, waiting for the catch that would reveal his true motives. But as the days passed, no catch materialized. Morrison seemed genuinely interested in her as a person rather than as property, and the novelty of being treated with basic human respect was almost overwhelming. On the 4th morning, as Mercy sat in the kitchen shelling peas for their midday meal, Morrison entered carrying a leather-bound book and a piece of slate with chalk. He set both on the table beside her bowl of pea pods. "You mentioned that Samuel taught you some reading," he said without preamble. "I thought you might like to continue your education." Mercy stared at the book, a volume of poetry by someone named William Wordsworth, as if it might bite her. "It's illegal for slaves to read," she said quietly. "You're not a slave here." Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact. "You're a guest in my home, helping with farm work in exchange for room and board. Guests are free to read whatever they choose." The distinction felt both meaningful and fragile. Mercy was still a runaway. Slave according to Virginia law, still subject to capture and return to the Hartwell plantation. Morrison's declaration of her freedom was generous, but had no legal standing beyond the boundaries of his farm. Still, when she opened the book and saw the neat rows of printed words, her heart raced with excitement. Samuel had taught her to read. Simple words and short sentences, but she'd never seen poetry before, had never encountered language used for beauty rather than mere communication. Morrison sat across from her and began reading aloud, his voice giving rhythm and music to words that danced with images of nature and emotion. When he finished the first poem, he handed her the slate. "Try copying some of the words," he suggested. "It will help you remember their shapes." For the next hour, Mercy practiced forming letters with the chalk, sounding out unfamiliar words under Morrison's patient guidance. The baby seemed to respond to the calm concentration, moving gently rather than kicking restlessly as it did when she was anxious or afraid. "Why are you doing this?" she asked during a pause in the lesson. "Teaching me to read, I mean. What's the point if I'm just going to have to hide who I am wherever I go?" Morrison considered the question seriously. "Education is freedom, Mercy. Not the only kind, but an important kind. The more you know, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the world beyond this farm. And knowledge is something no one can take away from you, no matter what else happens." His words reminded her of something Samuel used to say: "They can chain your body, but they can't chain your mind unless you let them." She'd thought it was merely poetic rhetoric at the time, but sitting in Morrison's kitchen with a book in her hands, she began to understand what both men meant. The reading lessons became a daily ritual, along with Morrison's gradual sharing of practical knowledge about the outside world. He told her about the Underground Railroad, not the mythical rumor she'd imagined, but a real network of safe houses and brave conductors who guided escaped slaves to freedom in the North. He described cities like Philadelphia and Boston, where free black communities had established schools and businesses and mutual aid societies. "There's a woman in Philadelphia named Frances Harper," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the growing dusk. "She's a teacher and a poet, published her own book of verses. Born free, but she works to help others find freedom too." Mercy tried to imagine such a life, a black woman who could read and write and publish books, who could walk freely through city streets without fear of slave catchers. It seemed as impossible as flying, yet Morrison spoke of it as simple fact. "How do you know so much about the Underground Railroad?" she asked. "About people like Frances Harper." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly in his chair. "I've helped before," he admitted finally. "Not often, but when the opportunity arose. Usually just providing a meal and a safe place to rest for a night or two. You're the first who stayed longer." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her, given his evident knowledge and preparation, but it still sent a chill of fear through her. "Aren't you afraid of getting caught?" "Terrified," Morrison said with a rueful laugh. "Every time. But terror isn't a good enough reason to turn away from doing what's right." That night, as Mercy lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the Virginia countryside, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been a pregnant slave with no hope beyond the desperate act of running away. Now she was living in relative comfort, learning to read poetry, and being treated with kindness by a man who risked everything to help strangers. It felt too good to be true, which made her constantly vigilant for signs that the situation might change. She watched Morrison carefully for any indication that his motives were less pure than they appeared, listened for sounds that might herald the return of slave catchers, and planned escape routes from every room in case she needed to run again. As days turned into weeks and her pregnancy progressed toward the 7th month, Mercy began to feel something she hadn't experienced since childhood: security. Not complete security that was impossible for a runaway slave in Virginia, but the kind of day-to-day safety that allowed her to sleep through the night without startling awake at every sound. Morrison maintained a careful balance in their interactions, treating her with respect while avoiding any behavior that might be misconstrued. He never entered her room without permission, never touched her without clear necessity, and always maintained the formal distance appropriate between a white man and a black woman in 1858 Virginia. Yet within those careful boundaries, a genuine friendship began to develop. They discovered shared interests in gardening and animal husbandry, similar views on the value of hard work and self-sufficiency, and complementary skills that made their daily collaboration increasingly natural. Morrison taught Mercy about crop rotation and livestock management, while she shared her knowledge of medicinal plants and natural remedies. One afternoon, as they worked together in the vegetable garden, Morrison suddenly straightened and shaded, his eyes with his hand looking toward the road that led to his farm. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "2 of them." Mercy's blood turned to ice. She was 7 months pregnant now, her condition unmistakable, and there was no time to reach the hiding place under the eaves. "The barn," Morrison said quickly. "Hide behind the hay bales in the back corner. I'll handle this." Mercy hurried toward the barn as fast as her swollen belly would allow, her heart pounding with familiar terror. From her hiding place, she could hear voices in the farmyard, Morrison's calm greeting and the responses of 2 men she didn't recognize. "Afternoon, Morrison," called one of the visitors. "We're conducting a follow-up search for that runaway slave, the one we tracked here a few weeks back." "I remember," Morrison replied evenly. "Told you then I hadn't seen anything unusual. Still haven't." "Thing is," said the second voice, "we got word from a reliable source that someone matching her description was spotted in this area recently. Pregnant Negro woman, moving carefully like she was trying not to be seen." Mercy pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the hay bales, hardly daring to breathe. Who could have seen her? She'd been so careful during her brief trips outside, and Morrison's farm was relatively isolated. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that," Morrison said. "But then, I spend most of my time working. Don't pay much attention to folks passing through." "On the main road. Mind if we take another look around?" asked the first voice, "just to be thorough." "Help yourselves," Morrison replied. "Though I'll ask you to be careful around the pregnant Mare in the barn. She's due to foal any day now, and strange voices tend to agitate her." Clever man, Mercy thought, warning the searchers away from the barn while providing a plausible explanation for any sounds of distress they might hear. She listened to boots moving around the farmyard, voices growing closer and then farther away as the men conducted their search. The barn door opened, and someone entered, but they didn't venture far inside before Morrison's voice called out, "I'd be careful in there if I were you. That Mare's been particularly skittish today. Kicked a board loose in her stall yesterday." The footsteps retreated, and Mercy allowed herself to breathe again. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she heard the visitors mounting their horses and riding away. Morrison appeared in the barn doorway and nodded toward her hiding place. "They're gone," he said simply. As Mercy emerged from behind the hay bales, she realized that the close call had changed something fundamental in their relationship. Morrison had just lied to law enforcement officers to protect her, had deliberately misled an official investigation. There was no going back from that level of commitment. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd risked. Morrison studied her face in the dim light, filtering through the barn walls. "They'll keep coming back," he said quietly. "This won't be the last time, I know." Mercy placed a protective hand on her belly, where the baby was moving restlessly, perhaps responding to her stress. Maybe I should leave now before. What? Before you give birth safely? Before you're strong enough to travel with an infant? Morrison shook his head. Running now would be the most dangerous thing you could do. He was right, and they both knew it. Mercy was committed to staying at Morrison's farm until after the baby was born, and Morrison was committed to protecting her until then. The die had been cast, and all they could do now was see the game through to its conclusion. As they walked back toward the house together, Mercy wondered if Morrison understood the magnitude of what he'd undertaken. He wasn't just hiding a runaway slave anymore. He was harboring a woman who was about to give birth to a free child, a child who would represent everything the institution of slavery sought to prevent. The stakes had never been higher, and the most dangerous part of their journey together was still ahead. October arrived with a sharp bite in the morning air, and the first hint of frost on the pumpkin vines. Mercy's belly had grown round and heavy, the baby now so active that she sometimes gasped when tiny elbows and knees pressed against her ribs. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, and the simple task of climbing the stairs to her room had become a laborious effort that left her breathing hard. Morrison had adapted the farm routine around her limitations, without making her feel helpless. He'd moved a comfortable chair to the kitchen so she could sit while helping with food preparation, arranged her reading materials within easy reach, and even built a small stool to elevate her swollen feet during their evening conversations. But despite his thoughtfulness, Mercy could sense an undercurrent of tension that seemed to grow stronger each day. Morrison had become increasingly vigilant, checking the roads more frequently, studying every visitor to neighboring farms with suspicious eyes. The easy rhythm of their daily life together had acquired an edge of anticipation, as if they were both waiting for something inevitable to shatter their fragile peace. The feeling proved prophetic on a gray Tuesday morning when Morrison burst through the kitchen door with an urgency that immediately set Mercy's heart racing. "Pack what you need," he said without preamble, moving quickly to the window to peer through the curtains. "There's a large group of riders heading this way, more than we've seen before." Mercy struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her heavy belly. "How many?" 8, maybe 10. "And they're not just searching randomly this time, they're coming straight here." Morrison's jaw was tight with controlled tension. Someone's talked, given them specific information about this place. The possibility had haunted both of them for weeks. Despite Morrison's careful reputation as a quiet, law-abiding farmer, helping runaway slaves was an open secret in some circles. All it would take was one person with a grudge, one neighbor seeking reward money, one careless word overheard in town. "The hiding place under the eaves?" Mercy suggested, though they both knew it would be inadequate for a thorough search. Morrison shook his head. "Too obvious if they're really looking. And you're too far along to squeeze into tight spaces safely." He moved away from the window, his expression shifting from worry to determination. "We're going to have to try something else." He led her quickly through the house to a room she'd never entered, his bedroom at the back of the first floor. The space was spartanly furnished with a simple bed, dresser, and wardrobe, but Morrison went straight to a braided rug in the center of the floor and pulled it aside to reveal a trapdoor she'd never suspected existed. "Root cellar," he explained, lifting the heavy wooden panel. "My father built it during the War of 1812. Thought we might need somewhere to hide valuables if the British came through. It's larger than it looks from above." Mercy peered into the opening, which revealed wooden steps descending into darkness. The space below appeared to be carved from the earth itself, with stone walls and a dirt floor that smelled of potatoes and preserved goods. "I can't get down there," she protested, eyeing the narrow steps. "Not in my condition." "You can and you will," Morrison said firmly, "because it's the only chance we have." The sound of hoofbeats in the distance lent urgency to his words. "Morrison, lit a small oil lamp and handed it to Mercy, then helped her navigate the steep stairs, one careful step at a time. The cellar was indeed larger than expected, perhaps 8 feet square and tall enough for her to stand upright, with shelves lined with preserved vegetables and cured meats. There's enough food and water here to last several days if necessary, Morrison said, arranging supplies within her reach. The air shaft is concealed behind the house, so you'll have ventilation. Try to stay as quiet as possible. Mercy settled onto a wooden crate that Morrison positioned for her comfort, the oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. What about you? What will you tell them? The truth, mostly. That I'm a bachelor farmer trying to make a living. That I mind my own business and expect others to do the same. Morrison paused at the foot of the stairs. Mercy, if something happens to me, if they arrest me or worse, there's a map hidden in the false bottom of my dresser drawer. It shows safe houses between here and Pennsylvania. Promise me you'll use it. Nothing's going to happen to you. Mercy said fiercely, though her voice shook with fear. Morrison smiled grimly. From your lips to God's ears. He climbed the stairs and lowered the trap door, plunging Mercy into a world of flickering lamplight and muffled sounds. Above her head, she could hear Morrison moving around the house, presumably arranging things to look normal. Then came the sound of horses in the farmyard, multiple voices, boots on the porch steps. The wooden floors amplified every footstep, every word spoken in the rooms above. James Morrison? The voice was authoritative, unfamiliar. That's right. What can I do for you gentlemen? I'm Sheriff Caldwell from Lynchburg. We have a warrant to search these premises for a fugitive slave. A warrant? Morrison's voice carried just the right note of surprised indignation. On what grounds? Information received from a reliable source indicates you've been harboring a runaway. Pregnant. Negro woman, goes by the name Mercy. Ring any bells? Mercy pressed her hand to her mouth to muffle a gasp. Someone had known her name, known she was here. But who? She'd been so careful, had barely left the farm, had spoken to no one outside Morrison's household. Can't say it does, Morrison replied. Evenly. I live alone here, work my own land. Don't have much truck with slaves, runaway or otherwise. Mind if we look around? I mind plenty, but I suppose you'll do it anyway, warrant or no warrant. What followed was the most terrifying hour of Mercy's life. She listened to heavy boots tramping through every room of the house, heard furniture being moved, doors slamming, voices raised in discussion. At one point, footsteps entered the bedroom directly above her hiding place, and she held her breath as someone walked back and forth across the floor. What's this room used for? Asked an unfamiliar voice. It's my bedroom, Morrison replied. Not much to see unless you're interested in my sleeping habits. We'll be the judge of that. The sounds of a thorough search continued, overhead drawers being opened, the wardrobe doors creaking, even the floorboards being tested for hollow sounds. Mercy sat frozen on her crate, one hand on her belly where the baby had gone completely still, as if sensing the danger. Then disaster struck. One of the searchers must have noticed something about the trapdoor's location, because she heard a voice say, "Hold on. This rug's been moved recently. See how the dust pattern's different." Mercy's blood turned to ice as she heard the rug being pulled aside, then the creak of the trapdoor being lifted. Light flooded down the stairs as someone held a lantern over the opening. "Well, well," said a triumphant voice. "What have we here?" Morrison's voice carried clearly from above. "It's a root cellar. Been in my family for 40 years. Feel free to check it for vegetables." Heavy boots descended the wooden steps, and Mercy found herself face to face with a man she recognized from wanted posters. Deputy Marshal Foster, known throughout Virginia for his success in capturing runaway slaves. He was a large man with cold eyes and a reputation for brutality, and the smile that spread across his face when he saw her was anything but kind. "Mercy Washington, I presume," he said, holding his lantern high. "You've led us quite a chase." "Girl," Mercy lifted her chin with what dignity she could muster. "My name is Mercy. I don't know about the rest." Foster laughed harshly. "Oh, you're a spirited one." "They always are, the ones who run. Makes breaking them back down all the more satisfying." More men crowded onto the stairs behind Foster, their faces showing various degrees of satisfaction, greed, and disgust. To them, Mercy realized, she wasn't a pregnant woman seeking freedom for her child. She was a valuable piece of property that had been recovered, worth significant reward money. "Bring her up," ordered Sheriff Caldwell from above. "Carefully now, damaged goods bring less at auction." The casual reference to her potential sale made Mercy's stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would help no one, least of all the baby who depended on her for protection. Foster gestured toward the stairs with mock courtesy. "After you, Your Majesty. Time to rejoin the real world." The climb to the main floor was awkward and frightening. Mercy's advanced pregnancy made the steep steps treacherous, and she had to accept assistance from men who viewed her as livestock. When she finally emerged into Morrison's bedroom, she found herself surrounded by armed men, all staring at her with the cold assessment of buyers at a cattle market. Morrison stood near the window, his hands cuffed behind his back and his face a mask of controlled fury. When his eyes met hers, she saw an apology there, and something deeper, a promise that this wasn't over. "James Morrison," announced Sheriff Caldwell formally, "you're under arrest for harboring a fugitive slave, interfering with the lawful recovery of property, and violating the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. "And what about her?" asked Foster, gesturing toward Mercy. "She be returned to her lawful owner for punishment and resale." Caldwell's voice was matter-of-fact. "The Hartwell Plantation has posted a substantial reward for her recovery." Mercy felt her knees go weak at the mention of Master Hartwell. She'd known this moment might come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. She would be returned to the plantation, where her defiance would be punished severely. Her baby would be born into slavery, would grow up as property rather than a free human being. But as the men began discussing the logistics of transport, Mercy noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. Morrison was watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone looking for opportunities rather than accepting defeat. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging the positions of the men, the weapons they carried, the exits from the room. When their gazes met again, he gave her the slightest nod, not resignation, but preparation. Whatever was about to happen, Morrison wasn't giving up. And neither, Mercy realized, was she. The baby chose that moment to deliver a powerful kick, as if reminding her that she was fighting for more than just her own freedom. This child deserved to be born free, deserved to grow up with choices and opportunities that slavery would never provide. "Gentlemen," Morrison said suddenly, his voice carrying an odd note of amusement that made everyone turn toward him. "Before you congratulate yourselves too heartily, you might want to consider something." Sheriff Caldwell frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Morrison smiled, and there was something dangerous in the expression. "It means you gentlemen have just made the biggest mistake of your lives." As if summoned by his words, the sound of additional horses reached them from the farmyard, not the ordered approach of law enforcement, but the thunder of riders moving fast and with purpose. Through the window, Mercy could see dust clouds rising in the distance, and her heart began to race with a different kind of anticipation. Morrison's smile widened as the sounds grew closer. "I believe," he said calmly, "you're about to meet some friends of mine." The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by war whoops and rebel yells that made Sheriff Caldwell's face drain of color. Through Morrison's bedroom window, dust clouds billowed across the farmyard as what appeared to be a small army of riders descended upon the property with the fury of an avenging storm. "What in the hell?" Foster began, but his words were cut off as the first riders burst into view. They were unlike anything Mercy had ever seen. Rough-looking men on horseback, armed to the teeth with rifles, pistols, and wicked-looking knives. Their leader was a giant of a man with a wild red beard and eyes that blazed with righteous anger. Behind him rode at least 20 others, all bearing the hard look of men who had seen too much violence and were prepared to see more. That, Morrison said with deep satisfaction, would be Captain Isaiah Briggs and his irregulars. Sheriff Caldwell's face went white. Briggs? The abolitionist raider? The very same, Morrison confirmed. I sent word 3 days ago when I suspected you might be planning something like this. Isaiah doesn't take kindly to lawmen who overreach their authority. The riders surrounded the farmhouse with military precision, cutting off all escape routes. Captain Briggs dismounted with fluid grace despite his size and strode toward the front door, his spurs jingling ominously with each step. James Morrison. His voice boomed through the house. Are you in need of assistance, my friend? I am indeed, Captain, Morrison called back. I seem to have some unwelcome visitors who are confused about the law. The front door burst open with a crash that shook the entire house. Captain Briggs filled the doorframe like an Old Testament prophet, his red hair wild and his coat billowing behind him. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a veteran commander. Well, well, he rumbled, his voice carrying the hint of an Irish accent. What have we here? A pregnant woman being terrorized by armed men in a private home, his gaze fixed on Sheriff Caldwell with laser intensity. I trust you gentlemen have proper warrants for this invasion? Caldwell straightened, trying to project authority he clearly no longer felt. I'm Sheriff Caldwell of Lynchburg County. We're operating under federal authority to recover fugitive property. Property? Briggs's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Did you just refer to this expectant mother as property? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even Mercy, who had never seen Captain Briggs before, could sense the barely controlled violence radiating from the man. His hand rested casually on the butt of a massive pistol, and several of his men had appeared in the doorway behind him, their own weapons prominently displayed. The Fugitive Slave Act clearly states, Caldwell began. The Fugitive Slave Act, Briggs interrupted, is an abomination before God and man, and any man who enforces it in my presence does so at his own peril. Foster, perhaps lacking the intelligence to recognize mortal danger when he saw it, stepped forward aggressively. You can't threaten federal officers in the performance of their duties, Briggs. That's treason. Quick as lightning, Briggs drew his pistol and placed the barrel against Foster's forehead. The deputy marshal went rigid, his eyes wide with sudden terror. The only treason I see, Briggs said softly, is the betrayal of human decency by men who hunt pregnant women for profit. He cocked the hammer with deliberate slowness. Now I'm going to give you boys a choice. You can ride out of here empty-handed and intact, or you can stay and explain to my men why you thought it was acceptable to terrorize an expectant mother. Through the window, Mercy could see more of Briggs's irregulars positioning themselves around the property. They moved with the discipline of soldiers, but the ruthless efficiency of guerrilla fighters. Several had already taken up sniper positions with rifles trained on the house. Sheriff Caldwell looked around desperately, clearly calculating odds that didn't favor his survival. This is illegal interference with federal law enforcement. There will be consequences. Consequences? Briggs laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sheriff, the only consequence I'm concerned with right now is whether these gentlemen leave my friend's property alive or in pine boxes. One of Briggs's lieutenants, a lean man with calculating eyes, appeared at the captain's shoulder. Boss, we've got their horses surrounded. No way out except on foot, and the boys are feeling particularly unsympathetic today. Mercy realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, a complete reversal of power dynamics that turned hunters into prey in the space of minutes. The men who had seemed so confident in their authority were now trapped and outgunned by abolitionists who operated outside the law entirely. Morrison, despite still being handcuffed, had begun to smile with genuine amusement. "Gentlemen, I believe Captain Briggs has made you a generous offer. I'd suggest you take it while it's still on the table. You can't just let them go." Foster protested, though his voice shook with fear. "She's a valuable piece of proper." Briggs pressed the pistol harder against the man's skull. "Finish that sentence, and it will be your last." The standoff stretched for endless seconds, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Mercy held her breath, one hand protectively covering her belly where the baby had begun moving restlessly, perhaps sensing the violence that hung in the balance. Finally, Sheriff Caldwell's nerve broke. "We're leaving," he announced, his voice carefully controlled. "But this isn't over. Federal marshals will be back." "They're welcome to try," Briggs replied cheerfully. "I do so enjoy target practice." With obvious reluctance, Caldwell gestured for his men to lower their weapons. "Release Morrison. We'll settle this through proper legal channels." "Oh, you'll release him," Briggs agreed. "But the legal channels you're thinking of don't apply here. You see, Sheriff, you've just attempted to kidnap a pregnant woman from the home of a good Christian man who is providing humanitarian aid. That makes you criminals in the eyes of any civilized court." One of Caldwell's deputies fumbled with a key and freed Morrison from his handcuffs. Morrison rubbed his wrists thoughtfully, studying the faces of the men who had invaded his home. "Captain Briggs," he said formally, "I want these men escorted to the county line and informed that they are no longer welcome on my property. If they return, I'll consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly." "It would be my pleasure," Briggs replied. He kept his pistol trained on Foster while addressing his men. "Boys, please escort these gentlemen to the border. Make sure they understand the geography clearly." The forced exodus was almost comical in its awkwardness. Caldwell and his men filed out of the house under the watchful eyes of armed abolitionists. Their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Through the window, Mercy watched them mount their horses and ride away under heavy escort, leaving dust clouds and wounded pride in their wake. When the last of the law enforcement officers had disappeared over the horizon, Captain Briggs finally holstered his weapon and turned his attention to Mercy. His fierce expression softened as he took in her condition and obvious exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully, "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. James sent word that you might be in need of assistance." Mercy struggled to process what had just happened. "Who are you people?" "Friends," Morrison said simply. Captain Briggs and his men work the Underground Railroad from a different angle. While most conductors help slaves reach freedom quietly, Isaiah's group provides more direct intervention when necessary. Briggs smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face from terrifying to surprisingly gentle. "We prefer to think of ourselves as freedom fighters, ma'am, and it's our honor to help ensure your child is born free." The word "free" hit Mercy like a physical blow. For months, she'd been running toward an abstract concept of freedom, never quite believing it was attainable. Now surrounded by men who had risked their lives to protect her, the possibility seemed suddenly real. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison moved to her side, his presence comforting after the terror of the past hour. "Now we make sure you and your baby are safe. Captain Briggs has connections throughout the North, safe houses, doctors, people who can help you establish a new life. But first," Briggs interjected, "we need to get you out of Virginia. Those men will be back with federal marshals and probably army support. This place isn't safe anymore." The reality of leaving Morrison's farm hit Mercy harder than she'd expected. For months, this modest farmhouse had been her sanctuary, the first place she'd felt truly safe since Samuel was sold away. Morrison had become more than a protector. He'd become a friend, a teacher, almost a brother. "When do we leave?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Tonight," Briggs replied. "We'll travel under cover of darkness, use back roads and safe houses to get you to Pennsylvania. Once you're across the state line, you'll be under the protection of the federal government rather than subject to slave catchers." Morrison frowned. "She's 8 months pregnant, Isaiah. Is travel really safe?" "Safer than staying here," Briggs replied grimly. "Caldwell struck me as the type to hold grudges. He'll be back with overwhelming force, and next time we might not be able to intervene." As if summoned by their conversation about her condition, the baby delivered a particularly strong kick that made Mercy gasp and double over slightly. Both men were immediately at her side, their faces creased with concern. "I'm all right," she assured them, though the baby's increased activity was beginning to worry her. "Just restless, I think." Morrison helped her to a chair, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Perhaps we should reconsider the timing. What if traveling brings on early labor? What if staying here gets her killed?" Briggs countered. "James, I've seen what federal marshals do to pregnant runaways. Death might be a mercy compared to what they'd put her through." The brutal honesty of his words made Mercy shiver, but she appreciated his directness. She'd lived her entire life under the threat of violence. Sugarcoating reality wouldn't help her make informed decisions. "I'll go tonight," she decided. "Whatever the risks, they can't be worse than certain capture." Briggs nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true freedom fighter, he turned to Morrison. "James, I'm afraid this means you'll need to come with us. They'll be watching your farm from now on, waiting for you to lead them to other safe houses." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, resignation, and finally determination. "I understand. How long before I can come back?" "Maybe never," Briggs said honestly. "Once you're marked as an active conductor, Virginia becomes too dangerous. But there's good work to be done in Pennsylvania, and brave men are always needed." As the two men discussed logistics and escape routes, Mercy felt a strange mix of sorrow and anticipation. She was leaving the only home she'd known since escaping the plantation, but she was also moving toward a future where her child would be born free. The trade seemed worth it, even if the journey ahead was uncertain and dangerous. Outside, Briggs's men were already preparing for the night's travel, checking weapons, studying maps, preparing supplies for a pregnant woman and a newborn if necessary. The efficiency of their preparations spoke to years of experience in moving human cargo along the Underground Railroad. As evening shadows lengthened across the farmyard, Mercy realized she was about to embark on the final leg of a journey that had begun with a desperate flight through the Virginia wilderness. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. The moon hung like a silver coin in the October sky as Captain Briggs's caravan prepared to depart Morrison's farm. 23 riders moved with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to dangerous night work, checking weapons, securing supplies, and preparing for a journey that would either end in triumph or tragedy. Mercy sat in a specially modified wagon that Briggs had produced from somewhere in his network of resources. The bed was lined with quilts and pillows, creating a nest of relative comfort for a woman so far along in pregnancy that every movement was an effort. Beside her sat a woman she'd never expected to see, a free black woman named Sarah Collins, who served as a midwife along the Underground Railroad. "Captain Briggs sent word ahead," Sarah explained in a voice like warm honey. "Said there might be a baby coming along the way, and babies don't wait for convenient timing." She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent bringing life into the world. "I've delivered more than 200 babies, child. This one's going to be just fine." The reassurance helped calm some of Mercy's fears, though her anxiety remained high. The baby had been increasingly active throughout the evening, responding to her stress with movements that sometimes stole her breath. Sarah had examined her carefully and pronounced everything normal, but warned that labor could begin at any time. Morrison rode alongside the wagon on a horse borrowed from Briggs's string of mounts. He'd packed only the essentials, some clothes, his sister's Bible, and the few family photographs that meant the most to him. Everything else, the farm his grandfather had built, the livestock he'd raised from birth, the life he'd constructed through years of patient labor, had been abandoned. In a matter of hours, yet when Mercy looked at his face in the moonlight, she saw no regret, only determination. Whatever doubts he might harbor about leaving everything behind, he kept them private. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly as the wagon jolted over a particularly rough patch of road. "Like I'm carrying a sack of wildcats," Mercy replied, trying to inject humor into her voice despite the growing discomfort. "But Sarah says that's normal for this stage." Morrison smiled, though worry lines creased his forehead. "We'll be at the first safe house before dawn. You can rest there while we plan the next leg of the journey." The safe house turned out to be a Quaker settlement hidden deep in the Virginia mountains, accessible only by treacherous paths that seemed to wind endlessly through dense forest. The community was led by an elderly man named Jeremiah Whitmore, whose peaceful demeanor masked a steel core of abolitionist conviction. "Friend Morrison," Whitmore said as he helped Mercy down from the wagon, "Captain Briggs sent word of thy situation. We are prepared to offer sanctuary for as long as needed." The Quaker settlement was unlike anything Mercy had ever seen. The buildings were simple but beautifully crafted, arranged around a central meeting house where the community gathered for worship and decision-making. Despite the late hour, several families had emerged to welcome the refugees, offering food, blankets, and quiet words of encouragement. Mercy was given a room in the home of a young Quaker couple, Thomas and Hannah Peterson, who had lost their own first child in infancy. Hannah's eyes filled with tears when she saw Mercy's condition, and she immediately began fussing over her comfort with the tender attention of someone who understood the preciousness of new life. "Rest now," Hannah murmured as she helped Mercy into a real bed with clean sheets and soft pillows. "Tomorrow we'll see about getting these safely to the next station." But morning brought complications that changed all their carefully laid plans. Mercy woke to sharp pains that radiated from her back around to her abdomen, coming at regular intervals that made Sarah's eyes narrow with professional concern. "How long has this been going on?" the midwife asked, timing the contractions with a pocket watch. "Since about midnight," Mercy admitted. "I thought it was just the wagon ride, but they're getting stronger." Sarah and Hannah exchanged meaningful glances. "Child," Sarah said gently, "I think thy baby has decided that today is the day." The news sent ripples of concern through the Quaker settlement. Captain Briggs had planned to move the group north immediately, but a woman in active labor couldn't travel. They would have to remain at the settlement until after the birth, risking discovery by pursuing federal marshals. Morrison paced the Petersons' front porch like an expectant father, his face etched with worry. "How long does labor usually last?" he asked Sarah when she emerged from the bedroom. "For a first baby?" "Could be hours, could be a full day," Sarah replied honestly. "But this little one seems eager to make an appearance. I guess we'll meet him or her before sunset." Captain Briggs materialized at Morrison's elbow with the silent stealth that made him such an effective guerrilla fighter. "James, my scouts report federal marshals are conducting a systematic search of the mountain communities. They're still 2 valleys over, but they're moving this direction." "How much time do we have?" Morrison asked. "Maybe 18 hours, maybe less if they get lucky or find a guide who knows these mountains." Morrison looked toward the bedroom where Mercy labored, then back at Briggs. "We can't move her now." "I know." Briggs's expression was grim. "Which means we'll have to make our stand here if they find us." Inside the bedroom, Mercy gritted her teeth against another contraction while Hannah held her hand and murmured words of encouragement. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, not just the physical agony, but the emotional intensity of bringing a child into a world where their future remained uncertain. "Tell me about Samuel," Hannah said during a brief respite between contractions. "What was he like?" Mercy closed her eyes, summoning the memory of her child's father. "He was gentle but strong. Could read and write better than most white men I knew. He used to say that education was the key to freedom, that knowledge was the one thing they couldn't take away from us." "What did he look like?" Sarah asked from her position at the foot of the bed. "Tall and lean, with hands that were always gentle, even when he was angry. He had scars on his back from a beating he took for teaching other slaves to read, but he never let it make him bitter." Mercy gasped as another contraction began. He would have loved this baby so much. As the day wore on, the sounds of labor mixed with the quiet activities of the Quaker settlement. Children played in the distance, women worked in their gardens, men tended livestock and craft work. But underneath the peaceful routine, everyone remained alert for the sound of approaching riders. Morrison spent the hours alternating between pacing and helping with settlement defenses. Captain Briggs had positioned his men in strategic locations around the valley, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any assault costly for attackers. But everyone knew that if federal marshals arrived with sufficient force, the settlement's pacifist principles would be tested against the reality of armed conflict. "The Quakers won't fight," Briggs explained to Morrison as they checked defensive positions. "It's against their fundamental beliefs. If it comes to violence, it'll be up to my men and whatever help you can provide." Morrison nodded grimly. He'd never considered himself a violent man, but the thought of Mercy and her unborn child being dragged back into slavery filled him with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. Late in the afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen across the valley, Sarah's voice called from the bedroom. "The baby's coming. Hannah, get more hot water. James, if he wants to be here for this miracle, now's the time." Morrison hesitated, unsure of the propriety of attending a birth to which he had no family connection. But Hannah appeared in the doorway and took his hand firmly. "Thee has been this child's protector as surely as if he were its father," she said with quiet certainty. "Come witness the moment when slavery loses another soul to freedom." The scene in the bedroom was primal and sacred, Mercy straining with efforts that seemed to draw on reserves of strength from some deep place beyond ordinary endurance. Sarah coaching her through each push with the authority of long experience. Hannah providing comfort and encouragement with gentle words and cool cloths. And then, just as the sun touched the horizon and painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, a new voice joined the tableau, the outraged cry of a baby taking its first breath of free air. "It's a girl," Sarah announced, lifting a tiny, perfect human being who had entered the world with fists clenched and lungs powerful enough to wake the dead. "And she's beautiful." Mercy collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Sarah placed the baby on her chest. The infant was small but obviously healthy, with a cap of dark hair and skin the color of café au lait. Her eyes opened briefly, showing the dark blue that all newborns possessed before settling into their permanent color. "Hello, little freedom," Mercy whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Welcome to the world." Morrison felt his own eyes fill with tears as he watched mother and daughter meet for the first time. After months of uncertainty and danger, after the terror of pursuit and capture, this moment felt like a miracle, the successful creation of a free human being who would never know the weight of chains. "What will thee call her?" Hannah asked softly. Mercy looked up at Morrison, then at Sarah and Hannah, finally settling her gaze on the tiny face of her daughter. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope Sarah Morrison." The middle name honored the midwife who had brought her safely into the world. The surname was Mercy's gift to the man who had risked everything to ensure this moment could happen. Morrison's breath caught in his throat. "Mercy, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "This baby was born free because of your courage. It's fitting that she should carry your name." Outside, one of Briggs's sentries gave a low whistle, the signal that riders were approaching. The valley. Morrison's moment of joy crystallized into sharp anxiety as he realized that Hope Sarah Morrison's first hours of life might also be her last hours of freedom. The final test was about to begin. The riders approaching the Quaker settlement moved with the deliberate precision of a military operation. Through his spyglass, Captain Briggs counted 47 men, a mixture of federal marshals, local sheriff's deputies, and hired slave catchers. They advanced in formation, surrounding the valley with practiced efficiency that spoke of careful planning and superior numbers. "They're not here for a friendly chat," Briggs muttered to Morrison as they watched from a concealed position on the hillside above the settlement. "That's a capture force designed to overwhelm any resistance." Morrison's jaw tightened as he studied the approaching threat. Below them, the peaceful Quaker community continued its daily routines, but he could see the subtle signs of preparation, children being quietly moved indoors, livestock being secured, adults positioning themselves near predetermined shelter points. "The Quakers won't fight," Morrison said, echoing their earlier conversation. "We can't ask them to compromise their principles." "We won't have to," Briggs replied grimly. "Jeremiah Whitmore and I discussed this possibility. They'll offer no violence, but they'll also offer no cooperation. Sometimes passive resistance can be just as effective as bullets." In the Peterson house, Mercy lay with baby Hope nestled against her chest, both mother and daughter recovering from the exhausting ordeal of birth. Despite her weakness, Mercy's maternal instincts had sharpened to razor-like awareness. She could hear the tension in the voices outside, could sense the approaching danger even through the walls of the small bedroom. Sarah Collins moved efficiently around the room, packing medical supplies and preparing for the possibility of immediate flight. How soon can she travel? Morrison had asked earlier, and Sarah's answer had been brutally honest. "Not for days, if we want both mother and baby to survive." Hannah Peterson sat beside the bed, her face serene despite the approaching storm. "Fear not," she said softly. "To Mercy, the light that guides us does not abandon those who seek freedom for their children." The first sign of the marshal's arrival was the sound of horses entering the settlement's main clearing. Jeremiah Whitmore walked out to meet them with the calm dignity that characterized all his actions, his hands clasped behind his back and his expression one of polite curiosity. "Good afternoon, friends," he said in his gentle voice. "How may we assist thee?" The lead marshal, a hard-faced man named Colonel Bradley, dismounted with military bearing and surveyed the settlement with calculating eyes. "I'm Colonel Bradley, United States Marshal Service. We're conducting a federal operation to recover fugitive slaves and arrest those who harbor them." "I see," Whitmore replied calmly. "And what brings thee to our peaceful valley?" "Information indicates that a pregnant Negro woman named Mercy Washington is being hidden in this settlement, along with the criminal James Morrison, who has been harboring her." Bradley's voice carried the authority of federal law. "We have warrants for their immediate arrest." Whitmore's expression didn't change. "Friend Bradley, we are a community of peaceful people who welcome all souls seeking rest and sanctuary. If there are those among us whom thee seeks, they are free to speak for themselves." The diplomatic non-answer clearly frustrated Bradley, who had expected either immediate compliance or obvious resistance. The Quakers' refusal to either confirm or deny the presence of fugitives created a legal gray area that complicated his mission. "We'll be conducting a systematic search of every building in this settlement," Bradley announced. "Anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction of federal law." "Thee is welcome to look wherever thy conscience guides thee," Whitmore replied. We ask only that they respect the sanctity of our homes and the peace of our community." From his hidden position, Morrison watched the marshals spread out through the settlement with growing anxiety. They moved methodically from building to building, searching every structure with professional thoroughness. It was only a matter of time before they reached the Peterson house. Captain Briggs had positioned his men in a defensive perimeter around the valley, but 23 irregulars against 47 federal marshals represented impossible odds in open combat. Their only advantages were superior knowledge of the terrain and the element of surprise, neither of which would help if the marshals discovered Mercy and the baby. The search reached the Peterson house just as sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. 6 marshals approached the modest dwelling, their weapons drawn and their faces set with determination. Hannah Peterson met them at the door with the same serene composure that characterized all the Quakers. "Good evening, friends," she said politely. "How may we serve thee?" "We need to search your house, ma'am," replied one of the marshals. "Federal warrant." "Of course." Hannah stepped aside gracefully. "We have nothing to hide from those who serve the law." Inside the bedroom, Mercy lay motionless with baby Hope pressed against her chest, both of them hidden beneath quilts that Sarah had arranged to look like empty bedding. The midwife sat in a chair by the window, calmly knitting as if this were an ordinary evening. Heavy boots tramped through the main room of the house, accompanied by the sounds of furniture being moved and searched. Mercy could hear Thomas Peterson's voice calmly answering questions about the household's residents and activities, his responses technically truthful but carefully unhelpful. The bedroom door opened, and one of the marshals stepped inside. His eyes swept the room, taking in Sarah's presence, the neatly made bed, and the various personal belongings that suggested normal domestic life. "Evening, ma'am," he said to Sarah. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Sarah looked up from her knitting with mild curiosity. "I'm a midwife, sir. Been visiting with Hannah Peterson about her hopes for children. Sometimes it helps to talk through these things with someone who understands the mysteries of birth." The marshal's attention moved to the bed where Mercy and Hope lay hidden beneath the quilts. "What's all that bedding for?" "Extra quilts for winter," Sarah replied easily. "Hannah's been working on them all season. Would you like to see her handiwork? She's quite skilled with a needle." Something in Sarah's calm confidence made the marshal hesitate. He stepped closer to the bed, and Mercy held her breath while pressing Hope gently to prevent any sound. The baby, perhaps sensing the danger, remained perfectly still. The marshal reached out to pull back one of the quilts, and Mercy prepared for discovery and capture. But at that moment, a commotion erupted from elsewhere in the settlement shouts. The sound of running feet and Colonel Bradley's voice raised in anger. "Sir," another marshal called from outside. "You need to see this." The bedroom marshal hesitated, torn between completing his search and responding to the apparent emergency. Finally, duty won out, and he hurried from the room without pulling back the quilts. Sarah continued knitting as if nothing had happened, though Mercy could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her tension. Through the window, they could hear heated voices and what sounded like a confrontation near the settlement's meeting house. The commotion, it turned out, was Captain Briggs himself. The guerrilla leader had surrendered himself to the marshals. Walking boldly into the settlement center with his hands raised and a sardonic smile on his face. "Colonel Bradley," he called out cheerfully, "I believe you gentlemen have been looking for me." The federal marshals immediately surrounded Briggs, weapons trained on the infamous abolitionist raider. Bradley himself strode forward, his face flushed with triumph and anger. "Isaiah Briggs," he said formally, "you're under arrest for violations of the Fugitive Slave Act, armed resistance to federal authority, and conspiracy to transport stolen property across state lines." Briggs laughed delightedly. "Stolen property? Colonel, I think you have me confused with someone who gives a damn about your immoral laws. Where are the fugitives? Bradley demanded. "We know you brought them here. What fugitives would those be?" Briggs replied innocently. "I'm just a simple businessman conducting perfectly legal activities." The interrogation continued for nearly an hour, with Bradley growing increasingly frustrated by Briggs's refusal to provide useful information. Meanwhile, the other marshals resumed their systematic search of the settlement, coming ever closer to discovering Mercy and baby Hope. As full darkness settled over the valley, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He emerged from his hiding place and walked calmly into the settlement center, his hands visible and his expression resolute. "Colonel Bradley," he called out, "I'm James Morrison. I believe you have a warrant for my arrest." The marshals immediately surrounded him, but Morrison showed no resistance. He stood quietly as they bound his hands, his eyes finding Briggs in the crowd of federal officers. "James," Briggs said quietly, "you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Morrison replied. "It's the right thing." Bradley studied Morrison with calculating eyes. "Where is the slave woman? Where is Mercy Washington?" Morrison met his gaze steadily. "I wouldn't know. I've been hiding in the mountains for days, trying to avoid capture." "You're lying," Bradley accused. "Our information indicates she gave birth recently. That baby is valuable property that must be recovered." "Property?" Morrison's voice carried quiet outrage. "Colonel, you're talking about a human child. A free human child, born on free soil. Born to a slave mother, which makes it slave property. Regardless of geography," Bradley corrected coldly. "Where are they?" Morrison said nothing, and Bradley's patience finally snapped. "Search every building again," he ordered his men. "Tear this place apart if necessary. They're here somewhere." As the marshals spread out for a second, more thorough search, Morrison caught sight of movement on the hillside surrounding the valley. Briggs's men were positioning themselves for what looked like a desperate last stand. Though they were still vastly outnumbered, the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Morrison realized that time was running out. Soon the marshals would discover Mercy and Hope, and all their sacrifices would be for nothing. The baby would be condemned to slavery before she was even a day old. But as the federal officers began their intensive second search, something unexpected happened. From every house in the settlement, Quaker families began to emerge, men, women, and children forming a human barrier between the marshals and the buildings they sought to search. They offered no violence, carried no weapons, and spoke no words of resistance. They simply stood, linked arm in arm, creating a living wall of passive resistance that would force the marshals to physically move them to continue their search. "What the hell is this?" Bradley demanded, staring at the unprecedented display of civil disobedience. Jeremiah Whitmore stepped forward as the spokesman for his community. "Friend Bradley," he said calmly, "we cannot in good conscience stand aside while they hunt a mother and newborn child. Our faith demands that we bear witness against this cruelty." The standoff that followed would be remembered for generations. 47. Armed federal marshals facing down an entire community of peaceful Quakers who refused to move aside. As the tension mounted and the night deepened, everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define the moral character of a nation. The standoff stretched through the night like a taut wire ready to snap. 47. Federal marshals with loaded weapons faced an entire Quaker settlement linked arm in arm, their children standing beside them in silent testimony against injustice. The autumn air grew cold, but neither side wavered as hours passed in tense silence. "Colonel." Bradley paced behind his line of marshals, his frustration mounting with each passing minute. He'd conducted hundreds of fugitive slave recoveries throughout his career, but he'd never encountered anything like this, an entire community willing to face federal charges rather than allow the capture of a mother and newborn child. "This is unprecedented," he muttered to his second-in-command, Major Walsh. "How do we handle civilian resistance on this scale?" Walsh, a career military man with little patience for moral complexities, was blunt in his assessment. "Sir, we have legal authority and superior firepower. Order them to disperse or face arrest for obstruction of federal law." But Bradley hesitated. Opening fire on unarmed civilians, including children, would create a public relations nightmare. That could damage the federal government's ability to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act throughout the country. Yet allowing the resistance to succeed would set an equally dangerous precedent out in the Peterson house. Mercy lay in the darkened bedroom with baby Hope, listening to the voices outside while Sarah Collins maintained her vigil by the window. Midwife had reported the developing situation in whispered updates, painting a picture of a community risking everything to protect a woman they barely knew. "Why are they doing this?" Mercy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They could all be arrested, their lives destroyed. They don't even know me." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "Child, he doesn't understand yet what thee represents to these people. Thee is every mother who's ever been separated from her children by slavery. That baby is every child who deserved to be born free. They're not just protecting thee, they're protecting the idea that some things are more important than law." Hope stirred against Mercy's chest, making the small sounds that newborns use to explore their new world. The baby's tiny fingers curled around Mercy's thumb with surprising strength, and Mercy felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her tired body. This child would not be enslaved. Whatever the cost, Hope Sarah Morrison would remain free. Outside, the confrontation was entering a new phase. Colonel Bradley had received reinforcements, another 20 marshals arriving from neighboring counties, along with a company of federal soldiers led by a young lieutenant named David Hayes. The military presence was meant to intimidate the Quakers into submission, but it had the opposite effect. "Friends," Jeremiah Whitmore addressed the assembled community, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "We are witness to a test of our faith and our nation's conscience. Let us remember that we serve a higher law than that which men write on paper." The Quakers responded by sitting down where they stood, creating an even more formidable barrier to the marshals' advance. Elderly men and women lowered themselves to the ground with dignity, while parents gathered their children close, creating family clusters of peaceful resistance. Captain Briggs, still in custody but not yet removed from the scene, watched the development with professional appreciation. "Colonel," he called out from his position between two guards, "you're witnessing something remarkable here. These people are showing you what courage looks like." "Shut up, Briggs," Bradley snapped. "This illegal resistance ends now." But even as he spoke, Bradley could see the impossible position he'd been placed in. Attacking unarmed civilians would make martyrs of the Quakers and turn public opinion against federal enforcement of slavery laws. Yet retreating would encourage similar resistance throughout the Underground Railroad network. Morrison, bound and under guard near Briggs, studied the faces of the federal officers. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the recognition that they were facing a moral challenge that couldn't be solved with superior firepower. "Colonel Bradley," Morrison called out, "perhaps we could discuss terms." Bradley turned toward him with sharp interest. "What kind of terms?" "Release Captain Briggs and his men. Allow the Quakers to return to their homes unmolested. In exchange, I'll provide you with information about Underground Railroad operations throughout Virginia." Briggs shot Morrison a sharp look of betrayal, but Morrison continued steadily. "You have me in custody already. You don't need to destroy an entire community to prove federal authority." The offer created a murmur of discussion among the marshals. Information about Underground Railroad networks was extremely valuable, potentially worth far more than capturing a single runaway slave and her newborn child. "And what about the woman and baby?" Bradley asked suspiciously. Morrison met his gaze without flinching. "What woman and baby? I've been hiding in the mountains for days. I wouldn't know anything about fugitives in this settlement." It was a careful dance of words that offered Bradley a face-saving exit. He could claim victory by arresting a known Underground Railroad conductor while allowing the Quakers to maintain their passive resistance without admitting defeat. But before Bradley could respond, Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward with information. That changed everything. "Sir, I've just received word from our scouts. There's a large force of irregulars approaching from the north, at least 60 riders, heavily armed." The news sent a ripple of tension through the federal forces. 60 armed abolitionists would outnumber the marshals and soldiers, turning what had been a law enforcement operation into a potential battlefield. "How long until they arrive?" Bradley demanded. "Perhaps an hour, sir. They're moving fast and know this terrain better than we do." The approaching reinforcements were part of Captain Briggs's larger network Underground Railroad, operatives who had received word of the standoff and were converging on the Quaker settlement to provide assistance. The possibility of armed conflict was becoming increasingly real. Bradley faced an impossible choice. He could order an immediate assault on the Quaker settlement, risking civilian casualties and a public relations disaster. He could retreat without accomplishing his mission, encouraging further resistance to federal authority. Or he could accept Morrison's offer and claim a limited victory while avoiding a larger conflict. In the Peterson house, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached Mercy's ears. But these weren't the disciplined sounds of military movement. They were the wild thunder of riders moving fast across rough terrain. "Sarah," she whispered urgently, "something's happening." The midwife moved to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. In the distance, she could see dust clouds illuminated by moonlight, and the occasional glint of metal that suggested armed riders. "Reinforcements," she said with quiet satisfaction. "Captain Briggs's people are coming." The knowledge that help was approaching gave Mercy renewed strength, but it also heightened her awareness of the danger. If the situation escalated into armed conflict, her newborn daughter could be caught in the crossfire. Outside, Colonel Bradley was making rapid calculations. His force was substantial but not equipped for a prolonged engagement with guerrilla fighters on unfamiliar terrain. The Quakers' passive resistance had already complicated his mission beyond anything he'd anticipated, and the approaching abolitionists threatened to turn law enforcement into warfare. "Major Walsh," he said quietly, to his second-in-command, "prepare the men for immediate withdrawal. We're pulling back to Lynchburg." "Sir?" Walsh looked confused. "What about the fugitives?" "What fugitives?" Bradley replied with bitter irony. "We came here on information that appears to have been inaccurate. All we found was a Quaker settlement and some Underground Railroad operatives who are now in custody." The decision to retreat was tactically sound but personally galling for Bradley, who had built his career on successful fugitive slave recoveries. Yet the alternative, a nighttime battle against superior numbers of well-armed irregulars with civilian casualties almost inevitable, was professionally unacceptable. As the federal forces began their withdrawal, Morrison felt a complex mixture of relief and regret. His offer to provide information about Underground Railroad operations had been a desperate bluff, but it had given Bradley an excuse to avoid further confrontation. The colonel could report that he'd captured important operatives while avoiding the disaster of attacking peaceful civilians. "This isn't over, Morrison," Bradley said as his men prepared to move out. "We know you're running fugitives through Virginia. We'll be watching." "I'm sure you will, Colonel," Morrison replied calmly. "But watching and catching are different things entirely." As the marshals and soldiers mounted their horses and began riding out of the valley, the Quaker settlement erupted in quiet celebration. Families embraced, children laughed with relief, and the elderly members of the community accepted assistance in rising from their positions on the cold ground. Captain Briggs's approaching reinforcements arrived just as the federal forces disappeared over the ridge, creating a moment of anticlimax that left everyone slightly disoriented. The expected battle had been averted through moral courage rather than superior firepower. In the Peterson house, Mercy heard the sounds of celebration and felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Baby Hope had slept through most of the crisis, blissfully unaware that her first day of life had nearly ended in recapture and slavery. "It's over," Sarah said softly, settling back into her chair by the window. "Thee is safe, and thy daughter is free." But even as the immediate crisis passed, Mercy understood that their safety was temporary. Colonel Bradley would regroup and return with larger forces, better intelligence, and new strategies. The Quaker settlement had won a moral victory, but it couldn't provide permanent sanctuary. Morrison was released from custody as part of the informal agreement that had ended the standoff, though he knew his movements would be watched from now on. His farm in Virginia was lost forever, and his future lay in the uncertain territory of the Underground Railroad. As dawn broke over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, the participants in the night's drama began to assess what had been accomplished and what challenges lay ahead. A mother and her newborn daughter remained free, but at a cost that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. The price of freedom, they were learning, was never paid just once. It required constant vigilance, repeated sacrifice, and the ongoing courage to choose justice over law when the two came into conflict. Sarah Morrison's first day of life had ended without chains, but the world she'd been born into remained divided between those who believed in human dignity and those who saw some humans as property. The battle for her freedom had been won, but the war for her future was just beginning. 5 years later, the modest house on the outskirts of Philadelphia buzzed with the sounds of a life built from hope and determination. Mercy Morrison, she had legally taken the name after reaching free soil, stood in her kitchen window watching her daughter Hope chase butterflies in the small garden behind their home. The child was 5 now, with her father Samuel's thoughtful eyes and her mother's fierce independence. She could read simple words, write her name in careful letters, and recite poetry that Morrison had taught her during their evening sessions by the fireplace. Most importantly, she had never known the weight of chains or the fear that had dominated her mother's early life. Morrison emerged from his workshop, sawdust clinging to his clothes and satisfaction evident in his weathered face. His carpentry business had flourished in Philadelphia, where his reputation for honest work and fair dealing had earned him customers throughout the city's growing free black community. "The rocking chair is finished," he announced, gesturing toward the workshop where he'd spent weeks crafting a piece for one of their neighbors. "Mrs. Johnson will be pleased." Mercy smiled, marveling at how easily the word neighbors came to them now. In Virginia, they'd lived in constant fear of discovery. Here in Philadelphia, they were simply another family contributing to the vibrant tapestry of city life. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first months after reaching Pennsylvania had been marked by poverty, uncertainty, and the constant fear that federal marshals might still track them down. Morrison had sold everything he owned to finance their escape, leaving them with little more than the clothes they wore and the fierce determination to build something better. But Philadelphia's abolitionist community had embraced them with open arms. The same network that had helped them escape slavery now helped them establish new lives. Morrison found work with a furniture maker who appreciated his skill with wood, while Mercy discovered a gift for healing that made her invaluable to the community's midwives and physicians. "Mama," Hope's voice called from the garden. "Come see the butterfly." Mercy joined her daughter outside, kneeling to examine the monarch butterfly that had landed on Hope's outstretched finger. The child's delight was infectious, her laughter bright as summer sunshine. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Mercy said, marveling at the creature's delicate wings. "Just like you." "Morrison says butterflies are born in dark places, but they don't stay there," Hope said with 5-year-old solemnity. "They break free and fly wherever they want." The metaphor wasn't lost on Mercy, who squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Morrison," had a gift for explaining complex ideas in ways that a child could understand, while planting seeds of wisdom that would grow with time. Knock at the front door interrupted their butterfly watching. Morrison answered it, and Mercy heard a familiar voice that made her heart leap with joy. Captain Briggs, though he looked different without his weapons and wild beard. "Isaiah!" Morrison exclaimed, embracing his old friend. "What brings you to Philadelphia?" Briggs had aged in the 5 years since their escape, his hair now more gray than red, but his eyes still held the fire that had made him legendary among Underground Railroad operatives. He'd continued his work until the Civil War began, then joined the Union Army as a colonel of colored troops. "Business," Briggs replied, though his smile suggested the visit was as much personal as professional. "And curiosity about how my favorite family is faring." They gathered in the parlor, a modest but comfortable room that reflected their gradually improving circumstances. Hope climbed onto Morrison's lap with the casual affection of a child who'd never doubted her welcome, while Mercy served tea in cups that had been a gift from the Quaker settlement. "You've done well for yourselves," Briggs observed, looking around the room with approval. "This is what freedom looks like when people have the chance to build it." "We've been blessed," Mercy replied. "The community here has been generous with opportunities and friendship." Briggs's expression grew more serious. "That's actually why I'm here. There's been a development in Virginia that you should know about." Mercy felt a familiar chill of fear, though it was less intense than it would have been years earlier. "What kind of development?" "Colonel Bradley is dead," Briggs said bluntly. "Killed last month at the Battle of Antietam, fighting for the Confederacy. But before he died, he made some interesting statements to a Union chaplain." Morrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of statements?" "Apparently, the good colonel had developed some regrets about his slave-catching career. Told the chaplain that he'd spent years hunting human beings and that it had corrupted his soul." Briggs paused for effect. "He specifically mentioned you," Mercy said. He'd never forgotten the pregnant woman who got away. The news was complex, mixing vindication with sadness. Mercy felt no joy at Bradley's death, but there was a certain closure in knowing that even her former hunter had eventually recognized the moral bankruptcy of his profession. "There's more," Briggs continued. "The Hartwell plantation was destroyed by Union forces 6 months ago. Master Hartwell fled to Richmond, and all his slaves were declared free under the Emancipation Proclamation." Mercy's breath caught. The plantation where she'd been born, where she'd lived in bondage for 19 years, was gone. The master who'd planned to sell her unborn child was reduced to refugee status. The entire system that had defined her early life was crumbling. "What about the other slaves?" she asked. "The people I knew there?" "Most joined the Union Army or found work as free laborers," Briggs replied. "A few asked specifically about you. They remembered the pregnant girl who ran away and wondered if she'd made it to freedom." The thought of her former community remembering her with something approaching pride rather than shame brought tears to Mercy's eyes. She'd often wondered if her escape had brought punishment upon those left behind, and learning that they'd eventually found their own freedom eased a burden she'd carried for years. Hope, who had been listening with the intense attention children bring to adult conversations they don't fully understand, spoke up suddenly. "Mama, why are you crying?" Mercy gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her close while searching for words appropriate to a 5-year-old's understanding. "I'm crying because sometimes good news can make you sad and happy at the same time. The place where I was born before you were born, it's different now, better." Morrison cleared his throat, his own emotions clearly moved by the news. "Isaiah, thank you for bringing us this information. It means more than you know." "There's one more thing," Briggs said, reaching into his coat to withdraw a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This arrived for you through Underground Railroad channels, no return address, but the handwriting looks educated." Mercy unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing a small wooden carving of a mother holding a baby. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of someone with exceptional skill. But it was the note attached that made her gasp. The letter was brief, written in careful script. For Mercy and Hope, Samuel sends his love from Canada, where he teaches free children to read and write. He has never forgotten, and he is proud. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Samuel Hope's father, the man Mercy had loved and lost to slavery's cruelty, was alive and free in Canada. More than that, he knew about Hope's existence, and was somehow following their story from afar. "How is this possible?" Morrison asked quietly. Briggs smiled. "The Underground Railroad carried more than runaway slaves, my friend. It also carried information, letters, and hope. Samuel's been asking about you for years, and word finally reached him about your new life in Philadelphia." Hope studied the carving with 5-year-old curiosity. "Is this my papa?" she asked, touching the carved figure of the baby. "Yes, sweetheart," Mercy whispered. "Your papa made this for you because he loves you, even though he's far away." As the afternoon wore on, Briggs shared more news from the wider world, the progress of the war, the changing attitudes towards slavery, the growing certainty that the institution that had shaped all their lives was finally dying. When evening came and Briggs prepared to leave, Morrison walked him to the door while Mercy tucked Hope into bed with her new carving clutched in her small hands. "You did something remarkable, James," Briggs said as they stood on the front porch. "You looked at a pregnant slave girl and saw a human being worth saving. That kind of courage changed everything." Morrison shook his head. "Mercy saved herself. She had the courage to run, to risk everything for her child's freedom. I just provided a place to rest." "And called her your queen," Briggs added with a knowing smile. "Don't think I didn't notice how you look at her, how she looks at you." Some love stories begin in the strangest places. Inside the house, as Morrison helped Mercy clean up from their unexpected guest, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a desperate runaway hiding in a haystack, terrified and alone. Now she was part of a family built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and gradual love. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Morrison as they finished their evening tasks. "Giving up your farm, your old life, everything you'd built in Virginia?" Morrison paused in his work, considering the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Mercy, do you know what I told Captain Briggs all those years ago? I said you were my queen. Not because of your station or your beauty, though you possess both, but because you taught me that some things are worth more than property or position or personal comfort." He moved closer, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to do right despite being afraid. You showed me that love isn't possession, it's protection. And you proved that freedom isn't something you're given, it's something you take, and then you defend with everything you have." Outside, Philadelphia bustled with the energy of a city where former slaves worked alongside freeborn citizens, where children like Hope could dream of futures unlimited by the color of their skin. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice and inequality still existed, but it was progress, built on the foundations of individual acts of courage and compassion. As Mercy and Morrison sat together in their modest parlor, she understood that their story wasn't really about escape from slavery. It was about the creation of family, the power of unexpected love, and the truth that freedom, once claimed, must be nurtured and protected by each generation. Hope Sarah Morrison would grow up knowing her worth, understanding her history, and possessing the tools to build whatever future she chose. That, more than any law or proclamation, was the true victory over the system that had tried to reduce her to property. In the morning, Morrison would return to his workshop, Mercy would tend to her healing practice, and Hope would play in their garden under skies that promised nothing but possibility. They had built something beautiful from the wreckage of bondage, a life where love transcended law and courage conquered fear. The pregnant slave girl who had hidden in a haystack had indeed become a queen, not through royal birth or marriage, but through the regal dignity of a woman who had claimed her freedom and used it to nurture life, love, and hope in a world desperate for all three. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.